Book 5 Chapter 54. From the outside, the House of Dolls looked picture perfect, like an American Girl store or the type of place that only existed in the minds of young girls playing tea parties with their dolls. Because there were dolls. Tons and tons of them. It was a Queen Anne-style home, except for two of the walls, the ones facing the street, were mostly windows. Through those windows, you could see tables set up for patrons who might want to have a tea party themselves, as the dollhouse was apparently a restaurant as well as a shop. Who would go eat in a place filled with those soulless creatures? I didn't know. There were lots of fabrics around the house with a checkered pattern, similar to the one usually found on a picnic blanket. The entire place was dusted and perfect, situated on the corner of a street in a well-to-do neighborhood with old houses and large trees. Out on the porch, 4 dolls had been set up in rocking chairs to greet the neighborhood. Only one of them appeared to be cursed, as its eyes just wouldn't stay still. For Carousel, this place was underwhelming so far. I had expected the walls to be made out of melted Barbie dolls or something. And yet, it was perfectly delightful, from a distance. Because no matter how good it looked as we walked down the street, the closer we got, the more omens we saw peeking out through those windows in the front. We stopped at the corner across the street from the house, and Antoine whipped out the atlas, which he carried with him. Ideally, we would keep the atlas at the loft so that it didn't get carried into a storyline and then lost to us forever. But we figured that if Kimberly got trapped in a storyline, the loft would also be lost to us. And if the atlas was there, it would be gone too, so there really was no safe place for it. Finding a way to copy the atlas without spoiling ourselves was on the to-do list. So, what have we got? Michael said. Is it safe to walk in? Or are we just gonna sit out here and stare? I cannot impress on you enough how difficult it is to search through this book, Andrew said. It was designed for someone with Eureka. I chuckled because I had come to the same realization myself when trying to search through the atlas. We would have our scholar back one day, and when we did, it would be his job to look through that damn book. I doubt the psychic would have sent us here if it was a death trap, I said. We paid her $40 whole. As much as that was a joke, I also felt like it might be true, that we could trust a lead from a paragon, at least within the terms of the normal game, if not under all circumstances. Perhaps if there had been some ominous warning along with it. Here it is, Andrew said. Unfortunately, this section is not nearly as complete as some of the others. That's because nobody wanted to go into the dollhouse, Isaac said. He was probably right. As Andrew read through the scant information about the House of Dolls, I noticed that Ramona was staring at the house. I followed her gaze up to the second floor, and sure enough, there was an open window. While the room was dark, it did appear that something was sitting in front of the window, not in a chair, but almost as if a bed was situated in front of the window. I could only see the silhouette. Spooky, I said. You think we're being watched? Ramona shrugged. I could tell from the look on her face that something was off. What's up? I asked. I don't know, she said. I just feel like someone's looking at me. I looked back up at the dark figure in the window. There could have been someone there, or I could have been looking at a pillow, I couldn't tell. I also felt something, but then, out in the open, my hysteric drop was making me all kinds of anxious. Andrew closed the book and handed it back to Antoine. I have to conclude that if the dollhouse were dangerous, then someone who had written about it would have mentioned it, he said. More than that, it is a restaurant of some sort, or at least I think I see a menu by the door. And restaurants are often safe enough to eat at, with some notable exceptions. I could understand the rest of them having their concerns. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to go through Carousel without being able to see omens easily, let alone see how they triggered. All right, I said. I'll go in and help scope the place out. We don't know this area very well, so we need scouts to stay out and keep a lookout. Isaac, that means you, as much as you probably wanted to go in the dollhouse. Oh, nuts, Isaac said. Lila, I said, if you would stay out for a while and just keep an eye out while I scope things out in there, we'll send for you if we find something. Technically, The lead that we were given was given to Andrew, Lila, and Michael, so it would make sense for her to go into the dollhouse. But at the same time, I was far too curious, and a little too much of a micromanager, to stay outside now that we were on the trail of something big. Your friends have all fallen, some here, some there. Till they have risen, you've no friends to spare. I fully expected to find a clue about the fortune, and I wanted to be there to see it for myself. The more I looked at those two little lines, the more certain I became that the straightforward warning was just a misdirect and that the true meaning was something else entirely. I was still working it over in my mind. "I'll stay out here with the Atlas," Ant-Man said. "I guess that means me, Andrew, Michael, maybe Cassie, maybe Kimberly." "Dinah," I said, looking at her, "do you want to look at some dolls?" "The first time one of those things says my name, I'm going to punt it across the room," she said. "Who else?" "Ramona, do you want to come?" I asked, noting that she was still looking at the upstairs window. She nodded. Kimberly wasn't that excited to go and Cassie was acting hesitant for some reason, so Andrew, Michael, Dinah, Ramona, and I set off across the road. As we got closer, I kept my eyes moving to try to get a layout and understand the omens. My worst fear was that they might be moving, as dolls tended to do in horror movies. But for the most part, the House of Dolls appeared to be an ordinary shop, lots of omens for sale, as well as a few trap items, including a baby doll that everyone in a horror movie would pretend was a real baby. Kimberly could use it with her pregnancy drop. I'd have to tell her about it. As we approached the porch, I was able to read the menu for the tea and treats available at the shop. The Teacup Cottage, House of Dolls Enchanted Teas and Sweets. Teas: Moonlit Gumdrop Elixir, Fairy Fog and Petal Brew, Whimsical Wishing Tea, Starlit Dream Draft, Midsummer Marshmallow Mist, Honeydew Glitter Gloss, Whispering Cloud Frost Tea, Velvet Rose and Sparkle Shine, Candy Floss Humming Brew, Sweets and Treats, Rainbow Glow Cakes with Sparkle Drizzle, Celestial Cloud Scones with Stardrop Jam, Mystic Gumdrop Carousel. Step into wonder, where each sip tells a story, and every bite feels like a dream. Those weren't exactly recipes I was used to, but then, I didn't drink tea, so maybe it was a perfectly normal menu. The possibility that a witch was about to eat us skyrocketed, but if we weren't going to take risks, we would be stuck in Carousel forever. Before we could open the screen door and enter the establishment, which had a big open sign in the window, a plump woman with a large smile and ruby-red cheeks quickly opened it for us. She must have heard us coming. Her hair was long and tied into pigtails, a bright, deep red that looked too uniform to be real, a wig, most likely. On the red wallpaper, she was simply an ordinary NPC named Darla. "Hello, welcome to the Teacup Cottage." She waved us all into the house. I wasn't in any hurry, still checking for omens and danger to make sure we were safe, but soon enough, we all scuffled inside to see rows upon rows of dolls of all sorts. There were way too many dolls to be comfortable, and at least half of them looked far too creepy for anyone to realistically want to display them. "Peter, we have guests," the woman called out. She turned to us, smiling broadly. "Would you like some tea? Did you see the menu?" Michael, Andrew, Dinah, and Ramona were not the slightest bit interested. I asked how much it cost. "Only $1, she said, "but the second cup is free." "What can I get you?" "I'm good," I said. "We'd just like to look around." "Wonderful. Be careful not to touch the dolls. Lots of them are antiques. The house is full of them, but whatever you do, don't go upstairs." "Now, which tea was it you said you wanted, son?" "No tea for me," I said. But she looked at me expectantly and replied, "I'll go ahead and get you some, you'll love it." "Peter," she yelled. "One order for Whispering Cloud Frost." She smiled back at me. When she left, Andrew looked at me and said, "I advise you not to drink the tea." "Thanks," I said as if I had to be told. "What exactly are we supposed to be doing here?" Michael asked. Andrew shook his head and took out the card Madame Celia had given him. "It has no instructions, no hints. I suppose we're just going to look around. Unless you think that Darla has answers. Meanwhile, I noticed that Ramona was looking straight up. What's up there? I asked. I don't want to say, she replied. I don't understand it. I tried staring up at the ceiling like she was, and it was true that there was something up there. I didn't know if I felt it because I had my semi-psychic background trop or because there was something up there that even an ordinary person could feel, a silent scream, pressing down. Here's your tea, dear, Darla said, having returned quickly. That was done fast, I said. Thank you, she said, we pride ourselves in our service. She handed me an empty yellow teacup, then lifted a matching teapot and began filling my cup. Except nothing came out. Would you like any sugar, dear? She asked. No. I'm good, I said. Thank you. Honestly, one of the creepiest things that could have come out of the teapot was nothing at all. Because it confirmed that Darla was more than just a little weird. That'll be $1, she said, and taste your tea while it's hot. Was I supposed to pay her $1? She didn't give me anything, and there was no way I was going to drink this tea anyway, but she held out her hand. I decided it was worth $1 just to end the interaction. I retrieved the right-sized coin from my pocket, and as she reached out for it, I fumbled a bit so that it dropped to the ground. I am so sorry, I said. No problem at all, she replied, bending over to grab it. Immediately, I dumped the invisible tea onto the ground with a silent splash, and when she rose back up, I brought the teacup near my lips to pretend I had just drunk the whole thing. You finished it? She exclaimed, laughing. Your mouth must be burning. Would you like some more? No, I couldn't, I said quickly. I insist. The second one's free, she said, lifting the teapot to pour me another fake cup of tea. Defeated, I said, we're gonna go drink it over here at the table. I led the group to one of the tables by the window. Book 5 Chapter 55 I set the cup in front of me, and the others joined me. After a quick look to ensure there were no omens under the seats, I admitted, that was embarrassing. They were silent, and I guessed if they weren't so distracted by the creepy dolls, they might have been laughing at me. Andrew was straight to business. It seems that every doll in here is an omen of some kind. Am I wrong about that? It's difficult for me to differentiate each doll on the red wallpaper. I looked around. No, I said. About half of them are omens, sure, but a lot of them seem to be omens for the same series, something called Summer Slumber Party, parts 1 through 6. That sounds about right, Dinah said, glancing at the variety of dolls. Personally, I said, I'd rather a doll be from a slasher than from some sort of haunting. Then I thought about it, looked over at all the dolls, and said, no offense. I don't get why we're sitting here, Michael said. Shouldn't we be, like, interrogating that Darla woman? You really think she has any good information? I asked, scooting my cup of invisible tea to the edge of the table. She seems a little off her rocker. Still, I didn't know what we were supposed to be doing here, and there didn't seem to be a good way of finding out. Luckily, the answer wasn't exactly hiding from us. There was a loud sound from upstairs, like a door slamming, and then footsteps. Darla screamed from the back of the house. We all jumped up from our table and ran to find her. I looked left and right, making sure we weren't encountering any omens. Don't stare in the mirror, I said as we passed one. I didn't even have time to see what its deal was. I just knew to avoid triggering it. There's something tough in that drawer, leave it alone, I added. As we made our way to the back of the house, we realized that the collection of dolls in the front was only the beginning. All right, folks, be ready to run for the door, I said. I could feel anxiety rising. There was danger here, even if I couldn't see it. And yet, I heard laughter echoing quietly around us, along with the pitter-patter of what sounded like a toddler's footsteps, but maybe gentler. Why the heck did we enter this place? I said aloud. It was instinct or maybe even the result of someone or something's drop. And then, suddenly, the laughter stopped, and all I heard was a very loud slurping sound coming from back in the direction we had just run from. I looked around the back room. It was just rows and rows of dolls with little tables set up, similar to the ones up front but much smaller, with lots of tiny teacups set out. Eventually, we found Darla lying at the base of the stairs. "Are you okay?" I asked, still cautious of any omens. "I'm fine," she said. "I don't know what came over me." "Do you need some more tea?" she asked me. "No," I replied. She nodded and started to try to stand up. At first she couldn't, and then she looked up the stairs at something I couldn't see and said, "Peter, I'm sorry. I'll just need a moment." I looked up the stairs myself, my heart pounding, expecting to see something horrifying. But all I saw was an empty hallway at the top of the stairs. "What's up the stairs?" Michael asked. "That's Peter," she said. "Can you see him too?" Of course, we couldn't see anything. "Maybe we should reconvene outside," Andrew suggested. I agreed. Things were getting too spooky in there. So, bidding Darla well as she sat on the steps, we all turned to leave. As we did, I caught a glimpse of the table we had been sitting at while we scoped out the place. My tea had been sitting right on the edge of the table, but now it had moved into the lap of a doll sitting where it had been. The doll was in the vein of Chucky but about 50 years older, with a little tan cap and lifeless eyes. Next to the doll was a knife. It was both an omen and an enemy, not unlike the grotesque. The storyline was called Kid Stuff, and it was a tough one. You triggered it by not playing make-believe with the doll and giving it food. I stopped in my tracks, piecing it together. I had to assume that's why we needed to have a cup of tea, to keep a thirsty doll distracted. The doll didn't move, and I had no evidence that it could move on its own, except for the fact that no one seemed to be around when it got onto the table. I wouldn't have stared at it for very long, but when we turned toward the door, it slammed shut, blocking our exit. Michael tugged at it and banged on it. It didn't budge. As we turned our backs to the door, bracing ourselves for a fight, Darla walked down the hall toward us and said, "Peter would like to see you." "We could jump through these windows," Michael suggested. "I could break through, no sweat." But as he said that, the shutters on the outside of the building closed around the windows, darkening the room and giving us a solemn answer. We were not getting out. Not that way. "This is highly unusual," Andrew said. I could hear a quiver of fear in his voice. Normally, he was analytical and calm, but now he was casting his logic out like a prayer. If we were being ambushed, I feel like it would have happened by now. We would have triggered an omen or something. This must be something different. I had to agree, though I was probably just as hopeful as he was. Before we could decide what to do, Ramona stepped up to the front of the group and said, "Take us to him." Darla turned and began working back down the hall. "What are you doing?" I asked Ramona. "Are you sure about this?" "No," she said, and then she started following Darla to the back. I tried to use my pseudo-psychic powers to sense what it was we were heading into, but all I got was a sense of something powerful on the other end. I hoped desperately it was all in my head. Still, we weren't getting out through the door, so I followed Ramona, who was following Darla, back through the house and up the stairs. Upstairs was just a normal, well-kept house filled with pictures. The photos featured a boy and a girl about the same age. They could have been twins. They looked like they'd grown up sometime around the 1920s, maybe earlier. For all I knew, it could have been as far back as the 1880s, though I didn't think photography of this type existed then. They seemed to be on a farm in the middle of nowhere, but they looked happy. A radio was playing softly in the hallway, an old-fashioned kind built into a cabinet. "Peter, I brought them here," Darla called out. "Are you sure the door was locked?" I asked Michael. I tried to pull it off its hinges. It wouldn't budge. I had to hope that Madame Celia hadn't sent us to our deaths. Darla led us across the landing at the top of the stairs to a bedroom. She opened the door and waved us in. "Here goes nothing," I muttered under my breath. When we walked in, the room looked like a normal one from the 1950s or so, lots of magazines and model cars, the kind that you paint with special metallic paints. But all that stuff had layers of dust on it and hadn't been used in a long time, it would seem. On the far side of the room, by the windows, was a hospital bed. And it was a man who I had to assume was comatose, given the feeding tube and the fact that he was out cold. His skin was gray, and his hair was so wispy and fine that I couldn't even tell its color, but it was something light. On the red wallpaper, he was labeled Peter who knocked on the door. He was level 50 with a host of tropes that I couldn't see. He was a paragon. My mood instantly brightened because, as terrible as my experiences with paragons had been, I'd rather face one up here than some sort of monster, ghost, or a demon any day. Whatever it was that Ramona and I had felt downstairs, or across the street, we were feeling it tenfold in this room. Whatever this man was, he was putting out a lot of psychic wattage. Or something was. "Hello?" I asked. No answer. Terrible customer service. While Peter never woke up, it wasn't true that he never answered because, like downstairs, there were dolls here too, though in a far more reasonable amount. One doll in particular was sitting on the desk. It was a terrifyingly lifelike humanoid, something like a cat or maybe a bear, it wasn't clear. It had fur, and its eyes moved from side to side mechanically. It also had a voice box, the kind that needed to be activated by pulling a string. The name Bastion was written on its front. With the influence of whatever Peter was, no string pull was necessary. "He sleeps and waits to be woken by his master," Bastion's voice box rasped. Bastion himself couldn't have said it any more terrifyingly. But I am limited without him awake. Quite a conundrum. It was one of the top 3 scariest voices I had ever heard. "He is like you," the voice continued. As if to emphasize who he was talking to, Ramona's hair lifted as though struck by a gust of wind. "I favored him, but he could not bear it forever, so I brought him here. But Carousel does not allow him to wake unless called upon. So I am stuck in the confines of this house lest I retreat to my other plane, always trapped between the two." Ramona was a mercer, which meant that she had some connection to a poltergeist. And its enthusiasm for protecting the mercers, it often ended up getting them, and bystanders, killed. Whatever this presence was, talking through a bastion, it seemed a lot like her poltergeist, bound to a man who could not live with its burden. "We wait until called upon, until one day we may go home." "Cured," the voice said. I didn't know what the etiquette was or whether we should ask its name, so I didn't. In fact, I was terrified. As happy as I was to see a paragon, I wasn't exactly hoping to meet one connected to some sort of spirit, ghost, or whatever this was. "Why were we sent here?" Andrew asked, building up courage faster than I did. "The script in his mind tells me that I am to give you a gift," the voice replied. "I will do this. Because I must." It continued, "For unless I regain my conduit, I will be here forever." "And what gift is that?" I asked. "It will call to you when you try to leave. You must avoid the hazards of the house, as I have been trapped here with a great horde of minor imps as an insult to my power," the voice said. And then it stopped talking. I was a bit worried. I didn't know the etiquette for meeting some sort of disembodied eldritch horror, but it was being absolutely rude. "Wait," Ramona said. "Do you have something to tell me?" It turned out he didn't. He had returned to whatever other plane he was trapped in, without his conduit, that is if I was reading the lore right. "Well, nice seeing you, Peter," I said as we turned to leave. And as I said that, my hair blew a little, which either meant the upstairs room was very drafty, or maybe Peter wasn't entirely gone. "So this really is just some sort of minor quest," I said. "Not that I mind that. It's nice to have a straightforward goal." "Better than the tutorial," Dinah replied. "What wasn't?" "Yeah, that's what I was thinking," I said, reaching the bottom of the stairs and heading back toward the front. When we got there, the doll with the knife was still sipping on my tea. And, as the disembodied, or maybe forcibly embodied, spirit had stated, one of the dolls did call out to us. It cried so loud, and suddenly, we all jumped. It wasn't even a spooky omen. It was a spooky trop item. It was just a baby doll, but one with moving eyes and an annoying cry. Its torso was hollowed out, filled with potpourri, or perhaps herbs and spices of the spell variety, and an assortment of symbols were carved into its plastic. You know, one of those dolls. Its trop was a hysteric trop with an effect I didn't quite understand at first. The trop, called Fear of the Unknown, would only trigger against dangers the user didn't otherwise have an awareness of. Attached to the terrifying baby doll, it seemed like it would cry whenever an unseen danger was near. I had no idea what that meant. Did omens count as dangers we weren't aware of, or did the fact that we were aware of them mean they wouldn't trigger the trop? I had to think on it. Dangers of the type the user isn't aware of. How much for the doll? Michael asked Darla. $5, she said, if you promise to give it a good home. We did promise it. We coughed up the money, and she went to grab the doll. She carefully wrapped it in some crepe paper as if she were swaddling it, then placed it inside a bag, which, to my mind, defeated the purpose of swaddling it, but I wasn't going to say anything. With that, we grabbed the bag and turned to leave. When Michael reached for the door, it took a bit of effort to open it, as if someone upstairs was having a little fun at our expense. As we crossed the street, Ramona said, "Riley." I turned to look at her, and she continued, "I have something on the Throwline tracker for an advanced archetype. It just appeared." "Huh?" I said. "I guess we are getting a lot out of this trip. Hopefully, one day, we'll figure out what advanced archetype you're about to unlock." "But it says what archetype it is," she replied. "What is it?" I asked. "Eldritch Conduit," she answered. "Nice," I said. I'd heard of that advanced archetype before, but I had to wonder, why did she get to see what advanced archetype she was working toward when everyone else hadn't? Was Peter the Eldritch Conduit Paragon? And by meeting him, was she able to see her progress toward the archetype? "How far along are you?" I asked. "Just 2 little dots," she answered. "Well, with a little luck, you'll be able to channel some unknowable entity, and hopefully, you won't end up inside a hospital bed in a dollhouse for the rest of your life." She smiled, but I sensed she was a bit more worried about that possibility than she let on. I had been thoughtless. She already channeled an entity, in theory, the same one that killed her mother and sister originally and had, in fact, killed her as a baby in her original timeline. As soon as we started crossing the street, the others saw us and started cheering, overly emotional. Apparently, seeing the shutters close on their own and hearing loud noises from inside the house had scared them, or something. So, what was the clue that would help us rescue Logan and Avery? There were definitely no werewolves in that house. What exactly did we need a doll that would cry around unknown dangers for? I mean, obviously, there were good reasons to have a doll with that power, but why specifically now? And how would it help us move forward on our task of rescuing Andrew's teammates? And what did it have to do with that fortune Celia gave us? Book 5 Chapter 56. Our next stop was happened upon. I had hoped it would have some answers, or maybe even the omen for the werewolf storyline itself, but that was a little too much to hope for. "So, normally, it's a lot different than this," I said as the group filtered into the pawn shop, looking around at the mostly barren shelves. Behind the counter stood a tall, bald, heavily muscled man named Tar Bellows, a paragon, one of the bruisers, as far as I understood it. "I can only stock used goods. Business hasn't been good," he said, barely looking up from his newspaper. Typically, the pawn shop was stocked with items related to recently run storylines, and since the reset, there hadn't been many storylines, so the shelves were nearly empty. What little inventory remained included some gardening implements from the final straw, some astronaut food from Itch, and a bunch of other items that might have been from storylines in the fake tutorial. A very small amount had tropes attached. Seriously, the place looked like it was either just opening or about to go out of business. When we had been here previously, there was a ton of stuff, props that could be used for various purposes, even before drop items existed. There were all kinds of electronics and supplies and weapons. "A lot of competition has been moving into my neighborhood," Tar said, pretending that our arrival wasn't the most exciting thing to happen to him in weeks. "Just can't keep up." "What's going on?" Ant-Man asked. "Are you allowed to tell us?" "Seems like everybody's in the business of selling specialty items these days," Tar replied. "Nobody needs to come to the pawn shop anymore." And then I understood. Until recently, most of the stores in Carousel only held props and survival supplies. Trop items didn't exist, so the pawn shop had been a kind of one-stop shop for most of the props someone could need. While the concept of having tropes that worked well with props, or that required props, existed, for the most part, the things you bought and brought into a storyline were for narrative purposes. Or weapons. You always needed weapons. Weapons didn't need tropes to be useful. Still, the pawn shop's supply of guns and knives had dwindled. "We're gonna look around," Ant-Man said. "Knock yourself out," Tar replied. There were a few omens for sale, a haunted cuckoo clock, or perhaps just an omen for a haunting that happened to be a cuckoo clock. A glove with dried, sticky blood on it, which could not have been legal to sell even at a pawn shop and would throw you into a murder mystery. A golf ball that bewilderingly launched you into an alligator-based horror film, or maybe it was a crocodile, I couldn't tell from the poster. But no werewolves. A broken Silas, the mechanical showman, stood in the corner as he always did, doing nothing, as broken things usually do. It didn't take 5 minutes to cover the entire store. There was just nothing there. The camera used in the final straw was for sale, but it was so big and bulky that it wasn't ideal for me to use as a prop. One thing the pawn shop did have, however, was tropes. The selection of tropes changed with every visit. Sometimes, there were powerful, game-changing tropes. Other times, there weren't. This time, it seemed like a mixed bag. I'm your biggest fan. Pipe film buff, pipe fanatic, pipe savvy, pipe insight. The user obtains information about characters who are famous or celebrities by acting as a fan. Hold the door, pipe bruiser, pipe gentle giant, pipe metal, pipe action. When the user blockades or holds a door, it will hold for a time. Timer indicates how long the door will hold. Out in left field, pipe athlete, pipe sport, pipe hustle, pipe buff. All projectile attacks using a bat or a similar object to launch a projectile receive a buff. Knock on wood, pipe psychic, pipe exorcist, pipe moxie, pipe action. The user can unjinx a pessimistic prediction, creating alternative outcomes or potentially debuffing the enemy's attempt to fulfill the prediction. There was one thing, pipe detective, pipe moxie, pipe insight. Witnesses of a crime will remember one unique detail that, if used effectively, will help solve the case or lead to a breakthrough. Duck and cover, pipe hysteric, pipe craven, pipe grit, pipe rule. The user will not be targeted in an all-out brawl as long as they stay low to the ground in a defensive position, allowing them to crawl safely. Won't waste a terror, pipe bruiser, pipe bully, pipe moxie, pipe rule. When the user bullies an ally set to be targeted by an enemy, the enemy will target the user instead. Keep pressure on it, pipe doctor, pipe medic, pipe moxie, pipe healing. The user commands an ally to apply pressure on a wound, which will be treated as cured as long as pressure is maintained. Why me, pipe final girl, pipe scream queen, pipe moxie, pipe buff. If the user wonders why they end up in dangerous situations during the rebirth phase, they receive a buff to a plan or action in the finale, showcasing their capability to handle such dangers. Book report, pipe scholar, pipe researcher, pipe savvy, pipe insight. The user gains knowledge from having read a scholarly text that becomes relevant to the plot, if applicable, giving them hints about what is to come. You look thirsty, pipe soldier, pipe GI, pipe perk. If the user has a canteen or sealed drink container, they can gift an ally a drink, which will always contain pure water. Healing. The drink refreshes the recipient and may heal minor pain and status ailments, depending on the context. Mono a mono, pipe bruiser, pipe brute, pipe metal, pipe action. By challenging a melee-based enemy in one-on-one combat, the user ensures the enemy will not use weapons as long as the user does not. Fellow traveler, pipe outsider, pipe criminal, pipe moxie, pipe scene. The user would be led to an early, mundane interaction with a disguised enemy. Insight. The user, through gut instinct or experience, learns details about the enemy's criminal background, possibly including their metal stat or enemy tropes. Flag them down, pipe pipe moxie pipe scene. When the user is running from an enemy and comes across a road, a car will stop to help if flagged down, either distracting the enemy or offering assistance. Couldn't pray it away pipe background. The user's character was neglected or abused as a child because their caretaker sensed something different, something paranormal, about them. Equip allows the user to equip a variety of tropes, including animal whisperer adventurer, past life biography medium, telekinetic nudge psychic, house sense departed, and a bat out of hell hysteric. It's been 20 years pipe background. The user's character has been in a coma for many years and has just woken up to a world that has changed dramatically, and they themselves have changed with it. Equip allows the user to equip ghost or psychic-related tropes, such as I don't like it here. Hysteric, forgotten memories psychic, eerie touch psychic, silent whisper eldritch conduit, and its needs to catch up outsider. Scathing review pipe eye candy pipe celebrity pipe savvy pipe insight. If this trop is equipped before the newspaper runs, a scathing, no-holds-barred review of the user's previous storyline performance will appear in the paper. Cliffhanger pipe action hero pipe grit pipe scene. The user initiates a major battle that ends in a cliffhanger over several scenes. Buff, during the cliffhanger, allies receive buffs for their pursuits. The user must survive and maintain the cliffhanger until they return on screen, at which point they are buffed to survive the situation. I stared at the selection. There were a few specimens we could pick up, a trop for a film buff, one for an athlete, one for a celebrity eye candy, and two very overpriced background tropes that would otherwise be obvious picks because they granted suit a psychicness, similar to my background trop. Not all storylines cared if you were psychic, but those that did cared a lot, so it would be useful to have a background trop like that. But they were selling them for $50 apiece. Kimberly, Antoine, and I debated purchasing one or both. Does being psychic help? Kimberly asked. I know that it's come up a lot. I shrugged. It does come up a lot, I said. I'm not going to say it's crucial, and we certainly don't want to be running an all-psychic team. Plus, those backgrounds, aside from the psychic parts, seemed kind of heavy, narratively. One of the background tropes would change your character's backstory to being an abused child, and the other would make it so you were in a coma for a long time. That could be tricky to work into a story, especially with as much improvisation as we like to use. How powerful could convenient backstory be for Kimberly if she also had to squeeze in that she was an unloved child? Especially when one of her favorite ways to use convenient backstory was to say her rich father had paid for her to have a niche lesson. I don't need it, Antoine said. And I really don't need the baseball trop, either. More times than not, my bat is hidden somewhere in a storyline where I can't find it. I don't want to rely on it more than I already do. Antoine's characters probably wouldn't care much about being psychic. Plus, those backgrounds would really get in the way of the healthy, energetic aspect of an athlete. I'll take that celebrity trop, though, Kimberly said, eyeing a trop that would give her a review of her performances. It was $20, but I could see how useful it would be. Understanding the audience's response could help her enormously. I got the film buff trop, though I didn't really want to fanboy for anyone. I would if I had to. Andrew purchased the doctor trop about putting pressure on a wound or, at least, commanding someone else to. It was a solid movie trop and a good action horror move. It made things seem intense and gave hope that someone could survive a vicious attack. Cassie picked up the psychic trop called Knock on Wood. The truth was, she had been collecting a lot of tropes and not using many of them. That would change in the coming months, surely, but that was also an issue with psychic tropes in general. They were often powerful but offered non-specific insights or abilities that might or might not have a huge impact on the story, depending on the storyline. Michael had no interest in the soldier trop. Offering water made sense in very few storylines, and honestly, I never wanted to run a storyline where drinking water was a life or death resource. Ramona didn't have enough money for the hysteric trop, and I could tell she wasn't exactly thrilled about pretending to be scared, or actually being scared. But I still bought it for her. If you have to act scared and pathetic to survive, that was fine. Although, truthfully, I didn't see Ramona as the type to duck and cover or crawl away. Dinah picked up the outsider trop because, while it seemed limited to human enemies, it was definitely valuable. Meanwhile, Kimberly picked up Flag Them Down, which would probably work well for an eye candy, especially if she was using Looks Don't Last. All told, we spent $107 at the pawn shop. And the tropes weren't even the most valuable thing we picked up there. So, Tar, Kimberly said, you seem to have your finger on the pulse of the carousel. Nope, Tar said, but go on. How might a player find the omen for a storyline when all they know is where the monster's lair is? Tar thought for a moment. Gotta ask around, he said. Aren't so many folks willing to speak candidly on that kind of thing? Aren't too many folks even allowed to? Do you know where any of those folks might be? Kimberly asked, trying to seem sweet. I wasn't sure that would work on Tar. There's a place you can go, and I'm not promising you'll find what you're looking for, but you'll find something, Tar said. Since you've never been there, you get a pass just once. The password is Pyrite. It's a place that's mostly peaceful, even in Carousel, but don't trust it too much. If there's gossip to be had about this storyline, you might be able to find it there. You always find something. A password? Kimberly asked. Is it like a club? Don't let anyone there hear you say that. There's some dangerous folks that go there, but that don't mean the place is dangerous, not before closing time, that is. There's a laundromat over on the corner of Drawn and Quartered. An old place. Hardly ever see anyone doing laundry in there. If you go to the back, there'll be a man standing by a door. You tell him that password, and he'll let you in. Sounds like a chicken fighting ring, Isaac said. Isaac was hardly the only person to comment on the day-to-day happenings at Carousel, yet I always seemed to remember his jokes. Well, if you're interested in fighting rings, there's probably someone there to steer you in the right direction. But this ain't that kind of place. This is a peaceful sort of place. A place where all stripes go to have a drink, away from prying eyes and the law. So it's like a bar? Ant-Man asked. It's like a bar, Tar said. Although I think they use the word speakeasy. And you might want to be careful, they change the password and the meeting spot every once in a while, so use your wits. No omens can go in the speakeasy, but trouble has a way of finding a foolish man no matter where he goes. I couldn't help but feel he was looking at Isaac when he said that. A speakeasy, I said. The Atlas talks about a bar but not a speakeasy, a place where a lot of players used to go where they wouldn't fight. Well, it's called the speakeasy, Tar said. I wasn't going to argue with him, but surely the bar I had read about in the Atlas couldn't be the same place as the speakeasy. Because if it was a speakeasy, that's what they would call it. It's such a cool word. Either way, the Atlas did mention a place where players from competing groups were set to meet. In fact, by no coincidence, I was sure, the entry in the Atlas where we learned that the monster lair had werewolves had taken place at such a bar. I had always assumed they were talking about different bars. And maybe they were. Maybe the speakeasy was one of Carousel's new changes, like drop items or the throwline tracker. Or maybe the speakeasy came into existence for our omen search and had never existed before. Carousel could change things on the fly and we would never know it. One thing I knew for certain was that we would be taking our crybaby doll wherever we went. We had been given a lead, just like the last lead, and we would follow it wherever it led. The thread unravels in the direction you pull it, so we got to pulling. Book 5 Chapter 57 We gently wrapped the crybaby's arms around the coat hooks at the entryway to the loft, both for convenience and practicality. Not to mention style. If something came along that we needed to know about, we hoped that the baby would cry and tell us. But that was actually a point of confusion. Ever since we had gotten the baby, it had yet to cry even once, and we had come close to some tremendous dangers in Carousel since obtaining it. We did that every day, just walking around. As I sat eating cream of wheat, one of the only breakfast cereals available at Easton Carousel General Store, I stared at the baby as it hung from its hooks and wondered what exactly the trap was supposed to do. Fear of the unknown activated around dangers the user was not aware of, seemingly a catch-all. I scratched my head while I thought about it because I had a theory about why it wasn't working. If it only worked on dangers you weren't aware of, that implied that if you were aware of the danger, it just wouldn't do anything. I wasn't the only one who was confused, but I was the only one who was thinking about it that morning, the day after we had purchased it. Everyone else was preoccupied. We had decided to postpone our journey to the speakeasy for a day because we wanted to get there around midday, as we had been told that we needed to leave at closing time, whenever that was. So, the sooner we got there in the day, the more time we would have to explore, and more importantly, the longer we would get to put off doing the dangerous endeavor of going to the speakeasy itself. We knew, in theory, that this was how Carousel often worked back before the days of Camp Dyer, before everything started coming apart at the seams. You find a problem, you go to a paragon to get an answer, and you follow their directions, continuously chasing clue after clue until you get your answer. In a way, our mission was almost mundane by Carousel standards. We weren't trying to figure out some grand scheme or understand the nature of Carousel. We were just trying to figure out the name and location of a specific omen. I had to assume that such quests were one of the reasons that paragons existed in the first place. Still, as I stared at the baby, waiting for it to start crying, I could feel myself growing nervous because everything we had done seemed to be going a little too well. Maybe it was just the fake tutorial that had given me that anxiety, but the paragons were helpful, and it felt like we were making progress. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The others were watching the strings attached in the living room. They were all lying down or sitting with their legs cross-scooted up near each other so that they could see the little TV I had purchased from the bare wire. They hadn't had such a convenient source of entertainment in a long time. We figured that some spoilers were worth indulging the occasional curiosity. Besides, we didn't plan on sending players to that storyline anyway. Last night, we had watched Hitch, and while we had anticipated we would enjoy it, no one actually had. It was such a source of frustration. Then we watched Delta Epsilon Delta, and that one was a lot more fun. We got to introduce everyone to Anna and Camden and watch our entire team fumble without knowing how to run a storyline properly yet. Andrew's team had already run it, so only Cassie, Isaac, and Ramona were spoiled. My triumphant scene, in which I revealed the killer while stumbling up the stairs, too delirious even to notice the killer was there, was actually quite good, other than the fact that it made no sense for my character to be the one to figure everything out. I was literally there as a red herring suspect, and it turned out that I was the one to solve everything. The others complimented me, but all I could think was how silly of a twist that was. It was like the main character changed for the reveal. This morning's choice was a bit of a thrill ride. Grace was so smart, Kimberly said as the strings attached played. I could see a tear forming in her eye. The finished film made Grace look like a major genius, and my scene of fighting off possession was one of the best sources of horror in the movie. Carousel had managed to catch the sound of my bones breaking in crisp, wet echoes. Can you imagine taking control and running a storyline without any research at all? I said as I watched her reveal what had happened during that wicked masquerade ball. I know, right? And one answered. They never even let us realize how much trouble we were in. Grace was a detective advanced archetype, originally a scholar. She had turned what was likely some sort of thriller into a proper mystery, and she had kept all of her teammates in line with a collection of tropes and an abundance of leadership that she had obviously learned from herding her team composed of 3 bruisers around. My little TV allowed me to show the players what I saw in the red wallpaper, and the obvious use of that was showing them all the films we had run that I could see because of my director's monitor drop. So, I was watching the movie both in my mind and with my real eyes. It was easy. I could do it just by thinking. I was just glad there wasn't a delay between them because that would be annoying. As soon as the movie was over, everyone begrudgingly rejoined the reality of what we had to do that day. Andrew and I had looked through the atlas for any references to the bar or a tavern or anything with the word speakeasy in it, and we had struck pay dirt. The speakeasy was also a criminal outsider trope. That's where the establishment itself came from. It allowed its users to incorporate the aforementioned speakeasy into any story they ran and explained why the speakeasy relocated. There was a whole half-page on the trope written in tiny script by someone whose handwriting looked like typed words. It was so neat and uniform. The speakeasy trope was really useful, creating a sort of sanctuary that could be used in a variety of ways. It was a trope fit for an apocalypse. It turned out the speakeasy just happened to exist even when that trope wasn't being used. Truthfully, there was probably more information about it somewhere in the atlas, but we had exhausted our abilities to search for it. Whatever the case, finding it in the atlas, even though we didn't get much information about the downsides of visiting the speakeasy other than the random warning that things often change in Carousel, did make me feel a lot more secure about visiting it. But that wasn't what was on other people's minds. Not first thing in the morning. Because after the movie was over, their minds switched back to the crybaby. Just as mine had been while I was eating my cream of wheat. So, we had one of our famous 11-person huddles around a table with only 6 chairs as we planned what we were going to do that day. "We need to go to the werewolf lair," Andrew said. Not discounting our tip about the speakeasy, I can't help but think that the crybaby was designed to help us stay safe near a monster lair. Whatever the case, having that answer will make me feel more confident about going into places we don't understand. Michael was on board, as was Lila, but of course they were his teammates. I found that most people were on board with his detour. Isaac and Cassie obviously agreed with him because they were his brother and sister, and the others seemed open to the idea of returning to the werewolf lair if only to put off the eerie feeling surrounding the speakeasy for a little bit. I wasn't going to argue. The only real downside was the walk. I had trouble hiding my pessimism over the soundness of the idea. We had already received another lead to move our little mini-quest further, so if it turned out that the crybaby was all we needed, it would seem like Tar had given us a time waster, or maybe he was just scripted to tell us about the speakeasy regardless eventually. Whatever the case, that was how we found ourselves on the long walk out to the Carousel Powerworks Pavilion that morning. Andrew volunteered to hold the baby. What a sweetheart. Again, Lila offered to show us how she could open up sound stages to traverse Carousel safely, but I didn't go for it, and I couldn't exactly explain why, other than it made me feel uncomfortable and that I would rather do things my way. She didn't seem to take it too hard, but what did I know? The trip there was uneventful, and the baby didn't cry once, even as we reached a part of the road where the smaller road up the mountain had been washed out by rain. "This is it," Andrew said. "This is the road she led us to." Andrew was actually nervous being back here. We all were. "I'll take the baby," Michael said. "See if it warns us about the lair." Andrew's face showed his shock immediately, and he stammered to explain to Michael that he was not going to be going into the werewolf lair on this trip. "We're just here to see if there is a notable interaction between the crybaby and the lair." Michael nodded. He almost seemed disappointed, like he had a grudge to settle. "Well, somebody's gotta say it," Isaac said. "Why don't we just sneak up there and get a glimpse at the werewolves on the red wallpaper and see what the storyline is called? Wouldn't that be faster?" Andrew shook his head. "In order to see what storyline they're from, we would have to wait for them to transform away from being normal NPCs. I'm afraid at that point, we would likely be too far in to ensure our escape." "You could use Oblivious Bystander," Antoine suggested. I noticed he was standing as far away from the forested side of the road as he could. "After the apocalypse, you used that, didn't you?" I shook my head and said, "Look, yes, Oblivious Bystander is a possibility, but first, I'd like to understand what we gained by getting closer to the lair. I thought our goal was just to see if the baby cried when we walked by it or something like that." "I assumed something would happen," Andrew said. "It seemed like we received the crybaby for this purpose." He held the cursed little baby doll out as its eyes moved side to side. I scratched my head. That would make sense if it said it would help you detect any danger. But it only helps you detect dangers that you're not already aware of. That seems like such a specific use case. It would work on that crooked hallway omen that showed up a few nights ago, Ant-Man said, not knowing if there was danger behind the door. Maybe that's why we were given it. That possibility had not occurred to the rest of us. What if the crybaby was just to help with the omens that arrived in the night? What if the crybaby quest was unrelated to finding the werewolf omen? I had hoped it would be useful for more than that, Andrew said. If it makes us more secure at night, that is truly great, but it felt like we received this in order to help us find the name of the storyline that Logan and Avery were trapped in. I had to hope that bringing it here would do something. After all, none of us were able to detect the lair when we arrived here a year ago and started to climb the mountain. I thought perhaps it would grant perception of the film's poster. Monster lairs didn't show up on the red wallpaper like omens did with our scouting tropes. Yet, at the same time, that wasn't to say we didn't detect them at all. After all, some combination of my hysteric scouting trope and my psychic background had clued me into the presence of something on the mountain that we were able to deduce was a monster lair. As I thought about that, stared up at the mountain, and felt the anxiety overcome me at how close we were to a monster lair, an idea struck me. I looked through the group. We weren't exactly the best stocked in scouting tropes. I got curious. Does anyone here feel like they can sense the monster's lair on the mountain? I asked. Because I can, especially now that I know it's there. They each gave me a funny look at first, and then they turned to the mountain. Most of them closed their eyes. Cassie stuck out her hands as if feeling for vibes. I have no idea, Kimberly said. I'm afraid, but I think that's just normal fear. I'm not getting anything, Isaac said. And that was the answer for most of them. Except for Cassie, who seemed to focus longer than the others, her face bound into knots of focus. Cassie was a psychic archetype, and she did have equipped a few tropes that should theoretically have some influence over her ability to sense something like a monster lair, even though they didn't explicitly say that they did. Even something like her I'm blocked trope, which allowed her to get some form of interaction with an entity within a storyline, might still work on a monster lair, even if she didn't know what the omen or storyline was. I was grasping at straws. I had no idea if psychic tropes made you psychic. Did the red wallpaper act as an interface with the power a trope gave you, or did it just help simulate the power? Do you feel anything? I asked. I think so, Cassie said, but I don't know if it's just in my head. Of course, it would be in your head. That's where psychic powers happen, Isaac said. Ha ha. So why are you asking? Ant-Man asked. I can sense that there is a monster lair there, I said. It would make sense that certain archetypes or certain tropes would innately give you some ability to detect a monster's lair. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the baby is supposed to detect things that you can't detect, so maybe us being here, those of us who detect the lair, well, maybe we should leave. So you take the wording of the trope literally? Andrew said. That it ceases to function unless it's your only resort? It's just a hunch, I said, and it doesn't hurt to take things literally sometimes. So, anyone who feels that they have some inkling that there is a monster lair on that mountain, come with me. Anyone certain that they can't detect it, stay here. So I turned and started walking back down the road. Cassie followed. So did Dinah, whose background trope often gave her supernatural insights, although not in the most direct way, as hers only allowed her to have some quasi-psychic vibes connected to the loss her character receives. Still, a trope that gives you psychic abilities might disqualify you from the crybaby's protection, and it didn't hurt to see what would happen. Sure enough, as soon as we were far away enough from the monster's lair that I could no longer feel it, I heard a baby start crying in the distance. We replayed that experiment several times to see if our hunch was correct, and it ultimately was. When Cassie or Dinah or I were in the group, the thing just didn't work. If Dinah took off her tropes, it did. If I took off my background trope, causing my scouting trope also to become unequipped, suddenly, The baby would cry when I was around. Even Cassie could get the baby to cry when she was around if she unequipped all of her psychic tropes, which meant that having a psychic archetype did not actually make you psychic. That was a whole other can of worms. So what have we learned? Andrew said. I think there's something strange up on that mountain, Isaac said. I mean, what did we learn about the crybaby's purpose? Andrew said. Given its niche use case? Many people offered suggestions, but I said, we learned it was given to us for a very specific reason. Maybe that itself is a clue. And that wasn't really an answer, because what did that mean? Where was a place that we needed to go where there was a danger none of us were aware of? Well, if it was the speakeasy, we were about to find out. Book 5 Chapter 58 The Laundromat we were directed to had perhaps one of the laziest names in all of Carousel, the Laundromat. Perhaps that was supposed to be ironic because, secretly, it wasn't just a laundromat, and therefore, just calling it that was funny. I wasn't sure, but by all accounts, it looked like an average laundromat to me. People were inside doing their washing and drying. There was a woman inside of a little office who would take your suits or dresses to have them dry cleaned, which was a nice thing to have at a laundromat. We ignored them all and walked to the back. As we followed the hall further into the building, we eventually found a large man standing next to a door whose only notable quality was that it was made out of thick metal and opened with a huge handle that might have been found on a door to a drug kingpin's compound. It was surrounded by industrial-sized washers and dryers. The man didn't say anything to us, but Antoine coolly said, "Pyrite." The man didn't respond, and for a moment, all we could hear was the laundry machines going as he looked us up and down and reached over to open the door with a metal squeal, revealing a freight elevator. I'm sure it's normal to have a freight elevator in a one-story building, Isaac said. The man didn't respond. Yeah, like we'd get into an elevator without a light, Isaac said, and he was right. There was no light inside the elevator. Isaac, I said, there's no omen. You can stop checking. He was calling out strange details, hoping to unveil an omen because that's how his scouting trap worked, but mine said nothing was going on, and the baby wasn't crying, so we were probably good. Probably. We stepped into the elevator, and as we did, a light flickered on. There was only one button in the elevator, so we pressed it. The trip down was jittery and frankly quite terrifying because, with all the shaking, it became possible that we were walking to our deaths despite all the evidence that we would be safe. That fear pushed itself into my mind. But then it stopped. There was a small gate between the elevator and the floor, and another goonish-looking guy was there to open it for us. Beyond that was a hallway with detailed red wallpaper, not the red wallpaper we saw in our heads, but similar. We loaded out into the hallway, and carefully, I led us down to the sound of music in the distance. Jazz music. The further we walked, the more sounds we heard, people dancing and laughing. There was an energy and a buzz in the air. As we finally reached the end of the hallway and turned to look, we saw a 1920s speakeasy absolutely alive with a couple dozen NPCs. The cocktail waitresses and the bartender were wearing outfits to fit the theme and era. People were gambling at blackjack and roulette. The bartender specifically caught my attention because not only did he have a wiry, muscular frame and sharp, penetrating eyes, but he also had a plot armor of 50 and a bunch of tropes I couldn't see. On the red wallpaper, his name was Vic Malone, but as I watched, his first name changed. It started at Vic and then became Roger and then John, and every few seconds, it would change. He spotted us the moment we rounded the corner. He didn't exactly smile, but there was something inviting about the way he looked at us, a sort of sardonic amusement. I couldn't spend all of my attention on him. There was just so much to see. Check out the two people dancing over by the piano, Dinah said. Her outsider's perspective drop allowed her to notice strange things quickly, and she had undoubtedly noticed something strange. The two people who were dancing were dressed to the gills and wearing masquerade masks. They didn't register as enemies, but rather as NPCs, and they didn't seem to care that we were there. But I recognized the style of those masks, and I knew for sure what storyline they were from. Miss Brunette and Mr. Cobalt ignored us and danced like that was the only thing that mattered to them. That couldn't have been a coincidence. Nothing ever was. There was a man named Cauliflower Bill set up at a table in the far corner with an easel, and he had a sign out that said, "Caricatures $10." He was marked as an NPC, too, but his sign had a picture on it of a collection of clowns at a circus, and I swore as I looked at that picture that one of those clowns seemed to be looking back at me. It was a terrifying clown that almost looked like it had another face painted above its real face with makeup. I had to look away. Does anyone else get the feeling that everyone here is an enemy? Ant-Man asked. I think you might be onto something, I said. And sure enough, as we looked around at the room filled with smoke and jazz, everyone who wasn't an employee did have a sort of dark look over them, a haunting gaze. Danger leaked from their aura, and even though I couldn't see any confirmation of this on the red wallpaper, my hysteric scouting trap "I don't like it here" was making me feel very anxious. The collection included all sorts of people, some carrying obvious weapons, others looking like ordinary folk. Should we leave? Kimberly asked, clearly unsure of whether we should be here. I had no idea. The baby wasn't crying, so there was no danger that we weren't aware of, but at the same time, there were plenty of dangers that we were aware of, and for some reason, they were all pretending to be NPCs. Let's talk to the Paragon over here behind the bar, I said. Tar had hinted that the speakeasy took in all types, but this was ridiculous. Ant-One was quick to talk to the bartender, and he didn't waste words. Are we safe here? He asked of the man. The man, Vic, or whatever his name was, Malone, smiled and said, You know, we don't get a lot of players around here these days. Wonder why that might be. Ant-One kind of dismissed his playful greeting and said, I just want to know if we should be here. Aren't Paragons supposed to help the players? Well, hang on there. There's a way of going about things. Don't just ask me if you're in danger. Endear yourself to me so that I'm inclined to help you, Malone said, smiling. His eyes were searching and revealed something his smiling face hid well, a slyness, a cleverness. He wore his sleeves pushed up, and his thin, nimble fingers could fit all the way to the bottom of the glasses he was polishing. He was one of those guys whose smile could transform his face from fierce and unwelcoming to charismatic and, frankly, warm. I welcomed that in a place like this. Take a beer for each of us, Ant-Man said. That'll be a 50-cent piece apiece, Malone said. Would you like to start a tab? 50 cents seemed like really cheap bros, and even though none of us actually wanted to drink at the moment, we were happy because we were still counting on the whole if you pay for something, you're safe logic, which was only 85% true at best in practice because plenty of restaurants and stores had dangerous things in them. As he poured our drinks, he said, and relax. These characters don't mean you any harm, and they couldn't if they wanted to. Not here. But I suggest you don't be too friendly with any of them because while you learn about them, they are learning about you. I looked over the cast of characters who were having a good time in the speakeasy that night. How many Black Widows, serial killers, and psychopaths were there with us? I had no idea. The crybaby didn't cry, and I never saw an omen. We found ourselves a booth, squeezed in, and listened to jazz. Eventually, we got Malone, the bartender, to come talk to us. He wouldn't talk to us at the bar. He scooted into the booth with us and asked, So, what brings you to this neck of the woods? People like you don't show up at a place like this unless they have a real good reason. Andrew was the first to talk. We're on a mission, he said. We're looking for a storyline that involves werewolves and takes place on the mountain near the Powerworks Pavilion. Do you have any information on the location of an omen for a storyline like that or anything that could help us? I see, Malone said. See, I cater toward the human type of killer. Then quieter, he commented to himself, fella comes in here asking about werewolves. Like he was making fun. What I suggest is that you drink, and you think on it, and just take it all in. You never know what you might find here. He smiled, got up from the booth, and walked back to the bar. This is useless, Michael said. I don't like going on wild goose chases, and I don't like being toyed with by those, whatever you call them, pelicans, politicians, paramours. Paragons, Andrew said. They are called paragons. The older version of the atlas that we have now talks about them. Doesn't matter, Michael said, and then he was the first of us to take his beer and take a swig, and because he didn't fall over, the rest of us followed, even though no one really drank much. Maybe we should take off all our tropes, Kimberly said, just to make sure that if there's danger here, none of us are unknowingly detecting it and stopping the baby from working. That was actually a smart idea. We were pretty emotional and tense, so if one of our tropes was detecting danger or magic or anything, we possibly would not know it, but our ability to detect it might stop the baby from crying. So we all took off all our tropes, and when the baby didn't cry, we put them right back on. How silly we felt after. It was a good idea, I said. Maybe we actually are safe here. It still didn't feel like it, and frankly, I was growing really frustrated not knowing why we were there in the first place. I let my eyes wander. There was a man drinking alone in the corner. He looked like a regular guy, probably good with the ladies if I could guess, but he spent all his attention staring at a woman and a man across the room, and occasionally the woman would look back at him like they shared a secret. I pieced together that they were working together to fleece the third man that the woman was talking to. Yep, from the looks of it, that fellow talking to the woman was going to have a rough night. Maybe I was just imagining it. Which is to say, I was having trouble focusing on why we were actually there. My eyes carried further around the room as I watched other narratives play out, a couple of con men trying to sell a coin to a dupe, a woman sneaking something into the drink of a jazz pianist, and so on. And the man over there in the corner just waiting to paint someone's caricature. Strange fellow. He didn't seem to be interacting with anyone. His eyes were yellow where the white should be and black everywhere else, not in a supernatural way, but more in a drinking himself to death sort of way. He had a funny shape to him, too, kind of like a bowling pin with noodle arms. His shape was so distinctive that I recognized him from the picture he had of all those clowns, even without his makeup. Does somebody want to go with me? I want to go talk to this guy over here, I said. It wasn't as if I thought he was part of our reason for being there, but I still wanted to know what his deal was and why a speakeasy filled with criminals needed a caricature artist. Antoine volunteered to go with me. As we approached, the man started to smile, a big toothy smile with yellow teeth that matched his yellow eyes. When he spoke, I could almost hear every cigarette he had ever smoked in his voice. "Can I interest you two gents in a portrait?" he said, coughing. "I'll give you one hell of a price, just $10. That was worth 20 beers in this economy. Would you like to see some of my other portraits?" he asked, flipping open a book filled with Polaroid pictures of drawings he had done. They were mostly of families with children, as well as a few romantic ones with couples, and of course, a few friend groups who decided to get their picture drawn together. "What's with the clowns?" Antoine asked, staring at the sign and the picture on it. "You like that?" the man said, not asking, but declaring. "Yeah, I work at the Low Top Circus. It's coming back to town next month. It'll be a thrill. This one's me," he said, pointing to the one that was obviously him because of his funny shape and yellow eyes. "You like being a clown?" I asked. "Oh yeah, but if I'm being honest, I mostly do it for the children," he said, then looked at me blankly. I looked through the picture at all the clearly murderous clowns. In movies, clowns usually come in at least two different versions of themselves. The perfectly ordinary one that you would expect to see at a real-life circus and the scary one that you would only see when you were about to be killed. The picture had the non-scary versions, and yet they were obviously still murderous, but not in a way that would hold up in court. I couldn't stare at the picture too long because the one clown with the face drawn above his face was starting to freak me out. I didn't know what I was hoping to see, but I thought that maybe because he wasn't going through his own little narrative like all of the other characters in the speakeasy, he had something to do with us. I looked at Antoine and shrugged my shoulders. He shrugged his shoulders back, and we went back to our booth, where everyone was on their second round, even if they didn't finish their first. Well, maybe we were supposed to go to the mall, Isaac said. Do you remember all those people talking about going to the real mall when we were at the outlet mall? It's malls all the way down. Think about it, there's a costume shop at the mall, remember? Maybe there's a werewolf costume, and we're supposed to buy it, and that's the omen. Wouldn't it make sense for a werewolf movie to have a werewolf costume as an omen, literally turning into a werewolf? He kept tapping his temple as if he was showing you exactly how clever he was. And yet, when he said that, all I could think was, what exactly would a werewolf costume look like in Carousel? Because there were so many different types of werewolves. Would it be a big fursuit, or would it be some sort of mask, or maybe some of that facial putty that you're supposed to glue onto your face to add a snout or something? As I started thinking about it, something occurred to me, and I really just couldn't stop thinking about it. Instead of taking my place back in the booth, I went back to the bar and took a seat there, and finally, the pieces started to click into place. Werewolves from different franchises didn't look alike at all, did they? Somehow, the thought brought me back to the fortune Madame Celia had given us. Your friends have all fallen, some here, some there. Till they have risen, you've no friends to spare. I had two pretty strong ideas, but how did they fit together? Tobe continued. Thanks for listening.